Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm Jason Dupree. I'm the Chief Executive at Privitar. Privitar enables organizations to use and share sensitive data for analytics and data science. I am joined here today by Vivienne Artz, currently the Chief Privacy Officer at Refinitiv, Vice Chair for the IAPP Board of Directors, previously the Global Head of Privacy at Citi. Just this month, Vivienne was recognized in the Queen's New Year's Honours List with an OBE for services to financial services and gender diversity. So I must say it's an enormous honor to have the opportunity to speak with you here today, Vivienne. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to cover a variety of topics, from the investment case for data privacy, the rapidly evolving landscape for professionals in this space, legal, data security, with everything from data protection through to data ethics. We will make some time for questions at the end, so please feel free to post these in the stage chat and we'll endeavor to pick them up as we go along. But perhaps now we could start at a high level. When I started working in data privacy in 2014, I spent much of my time explaining the terms and terminology and positioning against other big topics like freedom and security. At the time, many organizations were beginning to think about privacy spend and certainly data privacy spend as a defensive play, linked to their investment in brand equity and the trust relationship they'd fostered with their customers. Since then, so much has happened. We've had regulations come in, GDPR, CCPA. We've had massive privacy breaches with Cambridge Analytica and others. We've seen privacy actively recognized as a competitive advantage, thanks to Tim Cook and others. And of course, over the past year or so, we've seen the impact of COVID-19 on digital transformation. So, how do you process these impacts on the way we think about data and privacy? And Vivienne, importantly, how should we be thinking about our investments here, financial and otherwise, over the next few years?
So thank you very much, Jason, for inviting me today. An absolute pleasure to be here. And thank you also for your warm welcome. And also recognizing the OBE. That was a lovely way to start the new year, indeed. And of course, this is our favorite topic, is data privacy. And of course, tomorrow is World Data Protection Day, or Data Privacy Day. So it's a privilege to be part of the event. So in terms of organizations and spend and privacy, yes, we've seen an enormous leap in the amount of spend. And a lot of that's been driven, as we know, by GDPR. The long time that it took to be negotiated, the huge penalties which it seeks to impose or has the ability to impose, finally took privacy out of the back room and very much into the boardroom. And it has been a tremendous journey, certainly for those who've been practicing privacy for a long time. It started off as being a niche subject and one where you had to explain yourself each and every time. And increasingly now you can talk to people on the street and they are aware of privacy. They may not be privacy experts, but they're aware of privacy and the importance, the impact it has on their lives. So what's interesting is to see that privacy spend grew enormously in terms of the whole GDPR compliance project. And yes, there was a big focus on, is this just compliance, or is it more? Is it about building customer trust as well? Yes. Is it a market differentiator? Yes, absolutely. But I think the big question is where do we go from here? And I think last year we had a first really big, interesting data point with the Cisco Global Survey in relation to privacy. And they found that the average organization has a $2.70 return on every dollar spent on privacy. And they also noted that 40% of the organizations noted a doubling of the return on their investment when it came to privacy, which is tremendous, because I think previously it had always been seen as something as a bit of a black hole when it came to spending privacy to have an organizational-wide impact that actually generates a return on investment is a sea change and a tremendous leap forward. Not only helpful to privacy professionals, but helpful to an organization as well to recognize that it is meaningful and it is helpful and it really is making a difference across the board. So it isn't just about being able to have the conversations with customers when they ask you difficult questions about privacy, but actually it's making a meaningful change. So I think the next step for privacy, though, is to go beyond legal compliance and marketing to actually look at culture and ethics. And that's where I see the future of privacy going in 2021 and beyond, where privacy is part of the fabric of an organization and is actually moving forward. And the debate on ethics, because I think it is still hotly debated,
Sure.
is one that's helping to move that forward as well.
And do you, going back to that point, the shift from the defensive play, that spike in spend, which was driven by regulatory compliance, and what we've noticed is a shift towards more of an offensive play. As you say, looking to entrench these values more broadly within the organization, turning them into competitive advantage, looking for an upside return on these investments. Do you see that shift in perspective from looking at data, which I guess is intrinsically linked in the privacy conversation and how we use data to derive insight and so on, a shift from how we look at data as a liability and a shift towards looking at this more as an asset or as an advantage to be taken aware of? Do you see that?
Yes, it's interesting to see the maturing of that discussion, and it's one that I've been thinking about a lot recently as well, and moving the discussion away from personal data and privacy pure to one about data more broadly. So, there is a very clear legal distinction between personal data and non-personal data. But if we think about it practically within an organization, our information security policy applies to both personal and non-personal data. Our record retention policy applies to personal and non-personal data. We don't suck out the personal data out of our systems and store them somewhere different. The personal data is intermingled with the non-personal data and is one with our systems. We don't have a separate data center for personal data versus non-personal data. It all sits together. So I think if we broaden our horizons and start talking about data, that which is personal, that which is non-personal, recognizing the practicalities of how we actually handle it, then I think we are seeing a maturity, particularly with chief data officers and data management going forward, and one where we're looking at it much, much more holistically. I think that there is that discussion around, is data a toxic asset? There's a very good book, actually, Privacy as Power, by Dr. Carissa Belize from Oxford University that she published recently. And she suggests that data can be a toxic asset. And she's got some fabulous insights, but I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that particular one.
Yes.
I don't think that data itself is toxic. How we use data, how it can be manipulated, the context in which data sits, perhaps, that might lend itself to a toxic environment. But data per se, I feel is absolutely neutral. It's really what we do with it and how we use it.
And what about the lessons that we've learned, through the pandemic? Because I think, there has been this perhaps fixation with data as a toxic asset, or the fear of kind of the nuclear fallout from improper use of data. But as we've stepped into this crisis situation, it's been abundantly clear that data has been so valuable in terms of understanding the impact of the pandemic, planning the response, aiding the creation and the research efforts around therapeutics and vaccines and so on. Do you think that those lessons are going to be learned and found their way into common conscious across industries and verticals in that sense? Has there been a privacy lesson in that story?
Oh, I think there absolutely has. We talk about the leap to digitization during COVID-19 has been absolutely extraordinary, but also our sense of how we use sensitive personal data. I think COVID-19 was the ultimate test for sensitive personal data. Post GDPR, I think there was a real sense of paralysis, fear. How do you process sensitive personal data? It's so difficult, particularly, the health data. And yet we came across a set of circumstances in which we're still living, where we have to process sensitive personal data. It is actually in the overwhelming public interest. So we've had a real live environment in which to test how we use it, but also how we share it. And it's been fascinating to see governments making decisions about how we share data, how we communicate that, and how we protect it quickly. Not theoretically, not over a space of years, not through a consultation we can all think about and comment on, and maybe it'll come around sometime soon or later, but actually here and now. And it's been fascinating, for example, to see the ICO in the UK come out with fast, practical advice. If you want to help with PPE in your area, if you want to help identify those people who are vulnerable and can't get to the shop so you can deliver their shopping to them, etc., and you need to process personal data, yes, you can. Remember the principles. Remember to do the paperwork later. Don't forget it, but it doesn't stop you from doing the right thing, which I think has been great. So yes, it's been, yep.
No, I agree, and I think seeing that rapid response has been amazing. I think that it's been clear that we can move very quickly, and certainly in the interest of the public interest and so on. Are you worried though that through that process that there may have been any sort of inappropriate shortcuts taken? When we look back after the response, do you think that things might come a little unstuck with scrutiny?
I'm sure that there'll be things that we could have done better, without a shadow of a doubt. And in the rush to deal with a life-threatening situation, yeah, undoubtedly. But it's about balancing the risks, isn't it? And at the
Indeed.
end of the day, you can't be perfect. None of us is perfect. But I think what we have done has been really important. And we've also had an opportunity to test things publicly. So think about track and trace. It was wonderful to see some of the big tech companies coming to the fore and helping to create solutions with governments and regulators to help solve the problems, and having privacy at the absolute forefront of those solutions. It wasn't just the technical issues, and it wasn't the policy issues, it was the privacy issues that were right up there in terms of this is good, but how do we protect the data? How do we make sure it's not misused afterwards? How do we make sure that what we are processing is proportionate and fair? So for me, I thought it was a really fascinating, and has been a fascinating time to see live working through these key issues that impact everybody, and for it to be so public. So I think certainly there's been a huge and increased awareness around privacy and what it means for individuals during the pandemic. And yeah, it's been very exciting, both from a digitization and a privacy perspective.
I agree, and I think there was also this underscore on the importance of trust and just how important it was. I think that the general public all were very clear in the sort of general opinion as to how important trust was in those system designs, and the systems that failed in the end were those that hadn't really taken or calibrated effectively in that regard. So it was an enormously valuable lesson to learn. I think one thing we've also noticed is the shift. It's a subtle shift away from, we must protect data at all costs, privacy protection being, sort of the ultimate, to it is really important to be able to facilitate data sharing and data usage, but safely and ethically and in accordance with governance guidelines. So I think there has been a real shift in focus there.
The other point I was actually just going to say was, I think we also saw technology come to save us. if we hadn't had platforms like Teams and Zoom and others, government would have ground to a halt, schools would have ground to a halt, businesses would have ground to a halt, and generally in society. So I think what's interesting about this crisis as well is that it happened at a time where these platforms were available. If you roll the clock back a couple of years, I just don't know how we would have survived as a society without the ability to have those communication platforms. And of course, we've seen some challenges with some of them as well in terms of privacy concerns. But it's a balancing at the end of the day, and it's with or without. Go for it.
Absolutely, and couldn't agree more. I think going back to the point you made earlier, though, about privacy really evolving into a cultural piece, and seeping its way into the sort of fabric of an organization more broadly. Where do you see those mandates coming from? Because I think if we go back maybe 6, 7, 8 years, privacy was locked up in the chief privacy officer in a legal function in an organization. Now we're seeing so many job roles put their arms around this piece. We're seeing the chief data officer. We're seeing the impact on the chief information security officer. How do you see that shuffle sort of evolving over the next few years? Where does the mandate fall, and how do these pieces come together? And I guess, what does good look like, do you think, moving forward here for an organization?
So I think a couple of concepts that have been really important in helping this along is privacy by design and also privacy by default. And I think it was the Canadians actually who came up with that concept initially, and it was brought into GDPR. And the experience of GDPR was very painful for many organizations and for government. We mustn't always think of just the private sector. The public sector exists as well, and they've struggled with it because our businesses have evolved and our technology has evolved in a world where privacy was never taken into consideration. And trying to retrofit all of these obligations to legacy systems that were never designed to operate in that way. We're never designed to have restrictive access. We're never designed to operate with encryption, that were never designed to be able to localize certain particular areas and so on. It was an incredibly painful and expensive exercise. And I think part of that has led organizations to realize that actually, let's not retrofit. It's too terrible. Let's look forward and make sure that we integrate. So it is very much privacy by design and by default, not as a would be nice to have, but actually it's essential. It's the only way to go. It is the future. It's not going away. One of the data points I love is that 2/3 of the world now has privacy laws. So it's not almost 50%. We went past tipping point a while ago. And I think one of the challenges we have is every year there are new countries that are introducing privacy laws. So wherever you're operating, if you're not subject to a privacy law in your current jurisdiction, certainly your customers and your suppliers are undoubtedly going to be in jurisdictions where there are privacy laws. And so this is a reality of business. And so it needs to be integrated. So the tagline that we introduced at Refinitiv is privacy is the new normal. It's not something novel. It isn't an add-on. It isn't exceptional. It is the new normal. So get with the program, live with it, and that's how we see how we can thrive with it as well.
I couldn't agree. The supply chain is integrated. We live in a global community, and as you say, which countries don't have privacy laws that need to be taken into consideration nowadays? But I guess in that organization, you've got all these moving parts, and I think this perspective of let's integrate and think about privacy by design and default, super important. We were fortunate enough to hear from Anke Bakken earlier, actually. But who owns the mandate? Which job role sits in the organization saying this is the new normal? This is no longer a debatable topic. This is just the way things are done. Does that come from the legal team? Does that come from the security team? Where do you see that mandate coming from?
It comes from the board, and the executive leadership is really where it comes from. because privacy should be on every risk register. Privacy is integral to an organization. It's part of your marketing, it's part of your technology, it's part of your business plan. If you're trying to drive it from within legal, I just don't think that that's the right place. Legal should be there as an escalation point and as experts. If you're trying to drive privacy from legal, then you're continuing to make it a legal issue. It isn't a legal issue. It's a business issue. It's a cultural issue. It should be part of the DNA fabric of the organization. And so it needs that cross-functional mandate in order to ensure that it is embedded within the organization. So I think what's been interesting to see as well is in organizations, how privacy has been moving up in terms of seniority. And indeed, there is now a real challenge to find the right level of senior talent that can lead in the space of privacy. So, as I said at the beginning, backroom to boardroom, this is something that is, if not at the executive board level, certainly one or two levels down from there, in order to give it the mandate that it needs to ensure that businesses, whatever your silo within your organization, is adopting privacy as the new normal.
And I guess the challenge there is we want it to have that board level and sort of buy-in and senior stakeholder support, but at the same time, we really want to see it intrinsic at the edges as well, and every team and every business unit, adopting these best practices and embedding these privacy design concepts, privacy by design, privacy by default, into every system at the edge. And I guess therein lies the challenge. We mentioned the laws themselves, and I've got to ask, obviously, with your background, how do you think we had this massive, I guess, spike of data regulations and laws coming in globally, and now we're seeing that evolution of those. How do you see that developing in the coming years? We also see data localization laws appearing. Do you think those are going to be more widespread? And what does that actually mean for a global business? And I guess all the pieces you mentioned about this connected supply chain, that seems really complex. How do you sort of rationalize or think about that?
So I think you have to have a much more holistic view of it and think about data and all of the obligations that are associated with it and the responsibilities that are associated with it. The IRSG recently published a report on data localization and the impact on the financial services sector, and actually looked at different types of data localization. So what's fascinating is that although 2/3 of the world now has privacy laws, has that led to greater convergence or greater divergence? And I would suggest it's actually led to greater divergence rather than convergence, which is rather frustrating. And that's because privacy comes from different legal philosophies, regimes, etc. So in the EU, privacy is grounded in fundamental human rights. It is not grounded in fundamental human rights in many other jurisdictions. And although many countries have adopted some of the concepts from GDPR, they haven't necessarily adopted the philosophy behind GDPR. And so it's different versions, and that's incredibly challenging. But when it comes to localization, what's interesting is that privacy is often used as a tool to achieve localization. And we can see this in some of the evolving legislation around the world. But it isn't just privacy. Privacy is one of the localization mechanisms, but other localization mechanisms can be around outsourcing restrictions, trade concerns, around a consent-based approach, concerns to keep jobs in country, concerns by regulators that they need access to data. So both legal, philosophical, as well as purely practical reasons as to why data might be required to be localized. But what we are seeing is a much more fragmented approach toward data now, and personal data is caught within that matrix. Absolutely, but not exclusively personal data. And that's why I think it's important to look at it as a whole. If you just try and look at the personal data piece, you're missing the big picture, which is all data.
Kind of an interesting point there. We were talking earlier about defensive versus offensive postures when it came to these things, and the sort of business case and investment case for investment here. Do you think that varies then across jurisdictions? I mean, depending on the privacy posture in that region. So, might there be a significantly different opportunity in an area that adopts the European approach, privacy as a human right, versus other regimes where it might be more about preventing data egress from a jurisdiction? How do you think about the opportunities and investment cases across that fragmented landscape?
So it's a challenging one, isn't it? Because the more difficult the jurisdiction in which to operate, the more unattractive it becomes. And I think it's a very careful balancing act between how do we protect personal data and have a regime that meets the needs of individuals, the needs of business, the needs of government, with also being attractive for investment. And I think this is where the broader culture piece comes in. It's no longer acceptable to say this is an attractive jurisdiction in which to do business because we don't have any privacy restrictions, because actually customers demand that. If you think about the ESG agenda, actually it must be part of that. The social piece and the governance piece is respect for data and respect for individuals as well. And so I think there is an ideal middle ground where personal data is absolutely protected and respected, but is also understood in the context of the public interest and other needs and priorities, and that balancing happens. So what I think is very interesting to see is that trade agreements have never really addressed data previously, yet the UK-Japan CEPA agreement explicitly addressed data. Fascinating to see that. And they made an explicit statement that they would do their best not to pursue a data localization approach. Really, really helpful. So looking at what they have in common in terms of data, agreeing to high standards, absolutely, but also being practical and pragmatic about it, recognizing that data fuels and drives business and the economy, which is really important. And of course, the big one was the UK trade and cooperation agreement with the EU at the end of December. Personal data was never going to be a part of that because there's a separate process for adequacy. But that process couldn't be finished in time. And so as a stopgap measure and a highly creative one, what did we see? Suddenly, privacy was actually included in that agreement. It was so significant that time has been given to sort out the adequacy assessment, but the stopgap was the trade agreement. So interesting to see data, particularly the privacy issues, increasingly feature in trade agreements. And I think we will see that more and more as we go on, not as a trade-off, but as an element of supporting trade and acknowledging that there needs to be high standards and recognizing adequacy where appropriate.
And just recognition of the fact that not having those measures creates undue friction and has that negative economic impact, which I think if we're looking to create a healthy data ecosystem, then trade is such a key part of that, and kind of true to the original aims of the GDPR in many respects as well. So I mean, while we're on that topic, and the subject of international data transfers and so on, what do you see as the role of technology at play here? So, or do you just see that as a sort of one level below this conversation? If we think about safeguards, possibly the new post-Schrems SEC requirements, what do you think of technology's role in this arena?
I think technology has an enormous role to play. I think the CISO has always been the best friend of the DPO or the CPO, as the case may be. Certainly, you need to operate arm in arm in terms of information security. But what we're seeing is ways in which technology can help with some of the privacy issues. So the innovation in relation to technology around how can we use technology to help us share data without sharing personal data in order to reach a particular outcome? Really, really important. And I think we often refer to those as privacy enhancing technologies. There's a developing area of expertise in this space. And I think what's really exciting is if we could actually move to a point where what is readily accessible is the ability to use technology solutions to facilitate data sharing or data insights without actually sharing the data, because that would address a number of privacy concerns. As we know, just encrypting data doesn't remove the privacy obligations, because although encrypted, it's technically protected, but it's still personal data. But I understand that there are a lot of innovations which would actually preclude the need to share or to disclose the data full stop, and yet still allow the process or the outcome to occur. So the future is bright in that space, and I think we need to be exploring those sorts of opportunities more and more, and be creative about how we can protect data through technology, because that's very much the future.
Indeed, and obviously a topic very close to my heart. I think if we have a problem where we can disintermediate or figure out which data is required for a process and separate that from the sensitive information that we wish to prevent from leaking in a process, then privacy enhancing technologies or privacy engineering has a lot to offer in this area. I'm conscious of time, and I'd like to touch on one topic before we close. We talk about data protection laws and their potential expansion, but I guess there's always still the need for judgment, for human judgment in many cases. And I guess this brings us into this ethics conversation, because there are lots of things that one can do, and I sort of use this example a lot, that are perfectly private and in compliance with privacy laws, and do not leak sensitive information in any respect whatsoever, but are extremely unethical. And like one example I might bring up, I was working with a group at one stage, and that were presenting a program to influence subject choice in students. And their objective was to influence young women to select STEM subjects. So, arguably a noble cause, and it seems like a really good idea, but they became so good at leveraging data to influence behavior that it became almost a certainty that if you were exposed to this program, that these students would make the choices that they were being guided towards. And that raises some big questions, right? Here, we see data really used very powerfully in this way, arguably here for a good cause, but I think that's debatable. So how do you see this ethics piece evolving? Do you see that there's a legal element coming in here? Can we regulate this piece? How do different organizations need to think about this problem over the next 18 to 24 months?
Oh, it's a fascinating topic. There's actually three things I wanted to mention on this one.
Yes.
First of all, the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK has just issued a paper on algorithmic bias and the challenges around algorithms, which is very interesting to read, short and practical and to the point. Again, identifying that often algorithms can have an impact on individuals without them even knowing it. So there's nothing wrong per se with algorithms, but when you don't even know that an algorithm is guiding your choices, then you've got to ask, is that actually right, and is that actually ethical? And certainly as a lawyer, we know that there is a big difference between what is legal and what is right. And that's the role that ethics is increasingly playing. And I love the fact that ethics is now so very topical in business. I think it's very closely associated with culture, where we are looking to the broader customer impact and societal impact of what we do, and recognizing that we're not here just to make money or just to survive or just to achieve our ambitions, but there is a much more purpose-driven approach to business, to government, to society that actually we should be looking after each other and doing good, not just pursuing self-interest, as the case may be. So interesting, the UK ICO is actually doing a consultation at the moment on ethics boards. And isn't that fascinating? 5 years ago, who would have even thought about ethics boards? Why would you want one of those? But we are being presented with opportunities that data and technology can achieve, where we need to look beyond, is it safe? Have we protected the data? Is it legal? To actually, is it the right thing to do? What would the long-term outcomes be? And is that what we actually want to achieve? And I think we've all recognized that there is a bias issue that needs to be addressed in algorithms, but also there's an input data issue that needs to be addressed as well, which is, we often feed our algorithms with our existing data, which may be incomplete, incorrect, biased, or in some instances, we just don't have the relevant data. So, the output is bound to be rather weird. And so looking at the whole life cycle of data, the algorithm and the output, and then considering whether or not that's actually the right thing to do is becoming fundamentally important. So I really welcome that maturity in thinking and that approach. But I think one of the other things we also need to think about is, when we talk about privacy, what do we mean by privacy? I think we often conflate secrecy and confidentiality with privacy. There's a lot of overlap between the three, but they're not the same thing. And a clear understanding of what we actually mean by privacy will help us in those ethical thought processes.
And Vivienne, going back to that, this concept of an ethics board and asking these really big questions, is this the right thing to do? Is this a sustainable approach? And does this drive towards the long-term outcome? I mean, I could see that being attached, to the vision and mission of individual companies or individual organizations. But obviously, ethics issues are naturally highly subjective. We've seen from some of the work in AI already that unfortunately people don't agree on ethics, especially across cultural divides. So where do you see those ethics mandates sitting? Where do those boards sit? Is this something that gets established at an organizational level, or do we see something broader? Is there an ability to regulate at this level? Seems problematic.
No, very much so. I was actually listening to somebody today who said that there are more than 50 principles of ethics that have now been published out there. So, the EU has some, the UK has some, different countries have some, different organizations have them. So there are many, many different flavors of what the principles of ethics should be. And you're absolutely right. There are different approaches to what is considered ethical or not. Much of that is determined not only by sector, but also by culture. Culturally, certain things are far more acceptable in the US than they would be in the UK. Many things are acceptable in China culturally. It's an accepted way of doing things or seeing the way things are done that wouldn't be acceptable in France. So, there is a massive cultural dimension. I think that there is a temptation often to cast this very, very complex and difficult question up to a regulator, up to a third party, up to somebody else. But actually, my feeling is that it should really rest with the organization, because that fits in better with the whole concept of accountability. You know your business better than anyone else. You know your challenges, your customers, and what you want to achieve better than anyone else. If you don't want to be told what to do every 5 minutes, then demonstrate accountability and actually come to those conclusions yourself and be ready to defend them. Recognizing there isn't a single right or wrong. And I think it really does come down to organizations to be grown up about it, and take a view, and be willing to defend it. And you may, you may get clobbered, but at the end of the day, at least you've taken responsibility for it. And that's what business wants.
Indeed.
Business wants to be left alone to do its job, rather being told what to do every 5 minutes, because business knows more about what they do than government necessarily does.
And how do you think of communicating this to the end customer? Ultimately, there's a person at the other end of this data point, and earlier discussion was touching on food labels for data privacy. How do you think about this issue, data ethics? How do you communicate your approach or philosophy here to the end user, to the consumer, to the data subject?
I think it's something that it can always be seen as a bit challenging, and it's really around transparency, isn't it? How do you manage transparency with your customer? And I always think this is a really good opportunity to get the marketing people in the room. They know how to talk to customers. That's what they do. And surely they're the best people to communicate some of these more challenging decisions that companies need to make to their customers in the language they understand and in a way that they understand. I think we've come a long way from those hideous, long, complex privacy notices to considering better ways of communicating what we do. There's a lot of talk now about certifications and other sort of branding opportunities in terms of transparency and compliance with privacy laws that send an immediate message to customers. We adhere to this particular standard, and that way you can be assured that these are the sorts of practices we would have in relation to your data. But I don't think we should be afraid of being transparent with our customers, because at the end of the day, surely it's part of that whole circle of trust, which is if you trust me with your data, the only way you can trust me is if I'm clear with you on how I'm going to be using your data and the purposes. And, if you've got any questions, then ask and I will tell you. I think often intellectual property rights and trade secrets and such like are thrown up as barriers to that, but I think it's also very possible to explain what you're doing without having to go through the code with people. I don't want to know the code about anything. I just want to know, is it fair and is it proportionate and is it what I expected?
And I think maybe that's a great point to conclude on. I think whether it's data privacy or data ethics, at the end of the day, I think the data subject wants to have that trust relationship. They want to know that the organization that they're dealing with is honest and is doing what they say they're going to do and providing that transparency. And I guess, investing in the frameworks and the constructs to ensure that there's sufficient oversight over these processes in the organization. And with that trust, this ecosystem flourishes. Vivienne, we've got probably a minute before we need to conclude. Any final thoughts before we conclude the session?
Oh gosh, time went so quickly.
Indeed.
I suppose I'd say the future is bright for privacy. It is an integral part of what we do in our businesses today and in our businesses tomorrow. And having a look at some of the comments, I can still see that there's lots of different levels of maturity within organizations, and there are still many, many challenges. But privacy is here to stay. So stick with it, and together we can actually change the culture of our organizations to one where privacy is the new normal. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Privacy is the new normal. Thank you so much, Vivienne. Really appreciate your time today. That concludes the session. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.